Hello everyone, this is Professor Robert Solis. Welcome to our next video lesson. We're going to talk about functions in this particular lab. And the idea is this. Let's say that we create an application that allows a user to enter in two numbers. And after they enter in the two numbers, when they click the Submit button, it's going to return the larger of the two numbers. So what I've done is I've already created the Visual Studio, opened up Visual Studio and created the actual lab. So we're going to call it VB Lab 22 Project. And let me go ahead and make sure that you have the same names as I do. So for example, this text box, back over here to the top, here we go. This text box should be txt_num1. This text box should be txt_num2. The button should be btn submit. This label should be lbl result, and recall that the border style is going to be fixed 3D. And then of course we have a horizontal line here. You already know how to create that horizontal line. Notice that the minimize and the maximize buttons are not there, and that should do it. Okay, so that's the graphical user interface. Let me go ahead and double click on the submit button so I can show you the code. All right, well, the first thing that I want to do is I want to create a function called mymax. And what mymax is going to do is it's going to return the value, the larger of two values, I should say. Whenever you want to create a function, it's pretty easy. You just type in the word function, and then whatever the name of the actual function is. So let's say that this is going to be my maximum function, say for example. That's going to be the name of this function. Now if I were to do this, if I were to put open and close parentheses, that would be fine. All that I'm saying here is that this function does not receive any parameters, since there's nothing in between the parentheses. But what I do have to place here, since this is a function, right? So this is a function, so what I do have to type here is as space, and then what is this thing going to return? Is it going to return an integer? Is it going to return a double? Is it going to return a string? What is this thing going to return? Because it's a function, and functions must return something, and that's what this is over here. So let's say that this thing is going to return an integer, and then I press enter. Notice immediately how the end function is now automatically created for you. This is the beginning of the function, this is the end of the function. The name of this function is my maximum function. It doesn't receive any parameters, but what it does return is an integer. Alright, so if you're going to return something, you have to actually type the word return, let's say for example 10, right? So I'm returning the actual number 10, the value 10 as an integer. So here's what would happen. If in some other function, doesn't matter what, if it's another function or if it's another procedure in Visual Basic, if it calls my maximum function, it would go over here, it would execute the code, which in this case is just one line statement, return 10, and that would be at the end of this function. So functions are very similar to procedures in that they are a block of code or a chunk of code that does some particular task, but remember that in a procedure you don't return any values, but in a function you do return a value. Okay? Alright. Let's talk about what's inside of the parentheses. The parentheses are the parameters. So for example, if this thing is going to return, or if it's going to obtain one number, then I would have to determine, is this going to be by val, or is it going to be by ref? By val just simply means give me a copy of the value, and let's go ahead and call it xpar, and I'm going to declare this as an integer. So what this is saying is that in this function, it requires one parameter, and it had better be an integer. Alright, so over here, let's say for example I'm over here in the btn submit click button, right? So in other words, I was over here and I double clicked this, and so now I'm in the btn submit procedure, and let's say that I call this function called my maximum function. So I could call that and say num1 is going to be assigned my maximum function, parentheses, notice how it says I have to include one parameter within this within the parentheses. So let's say that I'm going to send it the number num2 and then press enter. Alright, so I'm going to call this function. I'm going to send to it num2, and then when it returns the answer, I will assign that to num1. So this is how you call a function. When you're going to call a function, you're probably going to be assigning it to something, right? So I wouldn't just do something like this. This would be an error. The reason why it would be an error is because this function is going to return something. How do I know? Because over here, first of all, I use the word function, and by definition, functions return stuff. Second, I can see over here that this function, called my maximum function, is going to return an integer. That's what this part over here says as integer. It's after the parentheses, right? So here's the beginning of the and the end of the parentheses. As integer over here means you're going to return something. All right, so this would be a mistake because I'm not assigning it to anything. Well, in this case, let me go ahead and just put it into num1 as an example, and there we go. So now I'm calling the function, giving it this as a parameter. When this thing is finished returning its business, then it's going to assign that to num1. All right, so that's how functions work. You don't have to have just one parameter. You can have multiple parameters. So I'll say comma, give me a second parameter by val, say for example. We'll call this one ypar as integer. Okay, so now what's happening is this. This function has two parameters, xpar and ypar. X parameter and y parameter are integers. Okay, so now notice what happens. I get that blue squiggly underline because this function requires two parameters. See, I only gave it one. So let's say that I'm going to put num1, for example. As soon as I do that, no problem. This function requires two parameters now. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction, but I think a clear understanding of how functions work. Very similar to procedures, except functions return values. Well, in this particular case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function called mymax. I'm going to give it two numbers. I'm going to give it num1 par and num2 par. So that's what I expect to receive whenever this function is called. Then I'm going to use the max function within math. So math.max, if you don't remember, it is used to return the larger of two numbers. Well, I'm going to put num1 par here, num2 par here, and so in other words what I'm saying is give me the maximum of these two numbers, whichever one is larger. Well, once I have discovered which one is larger, I need to return that answer. Okay, so in essence what's happening here is find the larger of the two and then return it. Well, what's going to happen here, let's see, where am I? In this part of the code, here it is. So what happens is I call mathmax. I send to it the number 1 and the num2. When it's finished, this is only going to be equal to either num1 or num2 because only one of them are the largest, or is the largest, I should say. So now that I find out the largest, this is either going to be, this highlighted section is either going to be num1 or num2. Once I have that, let me convert that number to a string and then put it into the text property of the label. As you can see here, I have a declaration of two integers, num1 and num2. So I'm going to get the text from the text box, txt num1, and put it into num1. I'm going to get the text from the txt num2 text box. After I convert it to a number, I'll put it into num2. Once I have these two numbers, let's find out which one is the largest of the two. Well, how do I do that? Well, I created a function called mymax. So I'm going to call mymax, and I'm going to send to it num1 and num2. So this is responsible for just finding the larger of the two. Problem, I had to put it into a text box. So that's where the convert.toString comes in. I put it into the text box, or to the text property of the label rather, and then problem solved. Okay, so let's run the code, verify that it works. Alright, so what I'm going to do is in this text box I'll type the number 1 and then I'll type the number 5, say for example. Click submit. Okay, 5 is returned. That's good, that's the larger of the two. Let me type in 11 here. Now click submit again. Notice now that 11 is returned. And that makes sense because 11 is the larger of the two numbers. Alright, let's step by step through this code to make sure that you understand how to debug it and also how it works. So I'm going to stop the code right here at this point where the assignment statement takes place, where we're going to take the contents of txt num1 and after we convert it, we'll assign it to num1. Okay, so I'm going to stop it right here. Let's go ahead and start the debugging process. And let me go ahead and type in the number 5 and the number 11 here. Click submit. Alright, so notice what's going to happen is we're going to stop the code right here, as you can see. If I hover my mouse cursor on top of here, you'll see that within the text num1 text box is the number 5, and that's correct. What we're going to do is we're going to take that text, which is 5, convert it to a number, and put it into the variable num1. So after I step over, you'll see that now num1 is going to be equal to 5. And you can even see that down here. Num1 is 5. Alright, good. Now let's take the contents of text num2. That's 11. Let's convert that to a number as well. And now you'll see that num2 is 11, which you can also see down here in the autos panel. All right. Well, now that we have these two, let's go ahead and let's find out which one is the larger. Is 5 the largest or is 11 the larger? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a function that I created called myMax. So here it is. Here's the function called to myMax. This means call this function and send to it num1 and num2, which is, you can see here, is the number 5 and the number 11. All right, I don't want to click this button if I intend on investigating the function. Step over would do exactly that. It would step over the function. I don't want to do that. I want to do this one, step into the function. So watch what happens when I click this guy over here, step into. Now you'll notice that I'm actually inside of the function. Okay, so I sent num1 and num2. Now notice over here that for myMax, I'm saying give me a copy. That's what you should be thinking when you see the word by val. Give me a copy of it. You keep the original, I'll get the copy. So num1 par is equal to whatever num1 is. So num1 is equal to, well, in this case it was 5, so it's going to be sent to num1 par, and that's why num1 par is 5, because that's what was sent to it. The second parameter, num2 par, is going to be 11. By the way, I think you should be noticing my technique, and this is, again, something that I've seen out in the industry. So if you see these two variables over here, num1, num2, could I have named this num1 and this num2? Sure, but in order to just avoid confusion, I'll add the 3 letters par afterwards, right? So this is going to be num1 par. This is going to be num2 par, right? Because it's num2, that's the variable that was sent, and par. But it really doesn't matter. I mean, I could have called this num1 and num2. It doesn't matter. This is something to make it more readable. But again, any good computer scientist would know that this num1 and num2 are not the same thing as if I just had num1 and num2 over here. They wouldn't be the same thing. But again, I'll add the word par to it just to give it a little bit more clarity. All right, so this is 5 and this is 11. Well, now what am I going to do? I'm going to take num1 par and num2 par, and I'm going to send it to the mathmax function. Now, math.max finds the maximum. Math.min would find the minimum. Well, I want to find the maximum, so this is going to return the maximum of the two. So when I step over here, and then, so in this case, I haven't called the function yet, but math.max is about to be given 5 and 11, and of course 11 is going to be returned. Now when 11 is returned, we're going to return that to the calling function, and that was over here, right? This is where we called the function. So watch what happens now when I step over. So we go to the end function, let me step over again, and now we go back to the initial call. Well, this is where our initial call took place. Well, in this case, the larger of these two is 11. Let's convert it and put it into the label. Okay, so in this case, if I were to step over, now you'll see if I hover my mouse pointer on top of the label, 11 has been in fact sent out. At this point, I'm not going to, when I end the sub here, I'm not going to step into, step over, or step out. I'm just going to go ahead and click continue so I can go back to my form, and there it is. I've verified that 11 has in fact been sent out to the label. All right? So that is a very simple example of how functions work, but I wanted to keep it simple just so that you would know, first of all, when you create a function, type the word function. Type whatever the name of the function is. What are the parameters? Put them in parentheses. If you're going to send copies, by val. If it's going to be the original that you're sending, by ref. And then what is it? Is it going to be an integer, double, string? What is it that you're sending? Just as important as all that stuff, remember that a function returns something. So if you're going to say, hey, this function called myMax is the name of the function, you also have to do this. After the parentheses, put as what? What are you returning? This function is returning an integer, or it could return a double, or a string, or whatever. So as integer in this case means it's returning an integer, and then with the return keyword, I'm saying send back this. This is the answer you want. So it's as if I give you guys a project. You do something, you give it back to me, and I get a chance to look at the work that you've done, right? That's in essence what's happening here. A function, you give it something, it processes the data, and then it gives you back a result. Okay? All right, so that's how this works. I hope this has been helpful. This is Professor Robert Solis. See you next time.